Hey Dino, how's it going?
Hey Carl, it's going really good. How about you?
I'm thinking about buying another motorcycle.
Come on, what are you thinking about buying this time?
Maybe a Dr650.
Dual sport. I like it. You know that's what I've got, right?
I know.
It's a great bike. Is there any questions that I can answer for you?
I want to know everything about that.
Everything.
I want to know how it works.
Well, today I'm going to tell everybody out there the history of the Dr650 and what my thoughts are on it. Today on Dino's Tinker Shed. Hi everybody and welcome. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the history of Suzuki's Dr650 dual sport motorcycle. I'll give you my opinion on what I think of the bike and how it performs as a dual sport and a small adventure bike. And we'll talk about whether or not I recommend a bike for someone who's really looking for this style of motorcycle. So designed back in the late 1980s, the Suzuki Dr650 was really a replacement for the aging Dr600. It was getting a little bit long in the tooth, and Kawasaki had already updated its KLR 600 to the KLR 650 back in 1987. And I'm pretty sure Suzuki knew that Honda wasn't far behind with a new punched out XR 650, which finally arrived in 1992. So in 1990, Suzuki released the updated Dr650 to the public, and it was a great, well-received motorcycle. Now, smaller than the Dr750 and the Dr800, the Dr. Big bikes, the Dr650 was a much more manageable machine. It had a little bit less horsepower, but it was also a little bit lighter and had a little bit lower seat height. Now, this particular bike is my bike. It's the latest generation of Dr650, meaning it debuted in 1996, and you heard me right, that's 25 years ago. This one happens to be a 2009, and I bought it used last fall as a bit of a project to tinker on. The bike had 40,000 kilometers, but when I saw it, I knew the bike was in good shape. It was exceptionally clean, and the owner had the entire history of the bike that they could tell me. I know that the bike was originally purchased by a gentleman who rode it from Ontario all the way to Alaska and did several adventure trips on it. And most of the mileage came from that first owner. It was later traded in and bought by a young lady in Guelph who used it to commute around the city for a couple of years until it was finally purchased by the owner that I bought it from, who used it to ride back roads and simple trails in and around Kincardine, which is on the shores of Lake Huron. When I purchased the bike, I took it for a quick test ride, and we're going to talk a little bit about what to look for when you buy a used bike in another video. But it really didn't take me long to realize this was the bike for me. Now, an area that a lot of riders complain about with the Dr650 is its cockpit, and in particular its dash. Now, the dash is Spartan, to say the least. I would say it's absolutely archaic. But when you really look at it, it does have pretty much everything that a rider requires. It has a speedometer with a trip meter and an odometer. It has your neutral safety light, turn signals, and your high beam light over tucked away down there. But where it lacks is creature comforts. Things like USB plugs or a really good spot to mount a GPS are really lacking, and the space is so tight it is really difficult for someone to figure out a way to get things to fit in such a way that they don't cover any of the amenities that the bike has. You can see here that I've made a small bracket out of aluminum. It's actually attached to a ram mount underneath that allows me to plug in this, to mount this USB plug. And my actual Garmin GPS, if you were to have a look, is actually mounted up to the fairing. Now, one of the things that makes the DR so fun for a lot of riders is the fact that you actually get to build your bike and figure all these problems out and customize it in such a way that you're happy with it, and as you ride around, you get to look at stuff and actually say, man, I made that. It's one of the sort of weird things about DR riders that I've found is they really like the challenge of making this bike something that it's not. The Dr650 seat, the scourge of all DR riders across the world who want to ride more than 2 hours at a time. It's earned some interesting nicknames over the years, such as 2x4, 2x6, seat from hell. But in reality, what most DR riders don't know or don't tell you is that there's really two different styles of seats available to be purchased from Suzuki. The bike comes standard with a motocross style seat, which I'll show you here in the cutaway. And it's made of fairly heavy foam rubber, it's taller, and it's skinnier than the optional gel seat that you see here. Now this seat is fairly low and fairly flat, and I find it's actually reasonably comfortable for an all-day ride. Now if this proves to still be a little bit too much for you, there are options. You can put seat covers such as sheepskin or foam rubber on there, and there's even things like this Airhawk saddle that looks like it was run over somewhere outside of Nova Scotia. We're not really sure on that. There's another story there to be told. But overall, you can make do with this saddle. Now, if you find that even with a seat cover or an Airhawk, it's just not enough, there are some options out there from third-party manufacturers. Seat Concepts, for instance, makes a great seat for this bike, and it really does turn it into a fairly decent small adventure bike. But what most long-haul riders will tell you, no matter how good your suspension is or your saddle is, if you spend 8, 10, 12 hours in it, you're going to start to become sore. And it really is a matter of body conditioning. So if you're planning on taking a DR or any bike for that matter on an adventure trip, be prepared for your body to be sore for the first few days until your body gets used to sitting in a static position like this for long periods of time. One thing to consider if the DR is on your short list of dual sport motorcycles is how you are planning to ride the bike. The suspension is known to be soft on the Dr650, especially the front end. It's a traditional style fork with a leading axle, but it still uses damper rods and has no adjustability for compression or rebound. Now for me, a person who rides basically on gravel and clay roads, it's not too bad. I don't push the bike too hard, and the soft ride's actually quite comfortable for my old fat bones. But if you're planning on taking it into some more like enduro areas or really rough areas, you may have to think about upgrading the suspension. Now some people replace the entire front end with something like a motocross front end, but a lot more DR owners actually tune the existing fork. They start usually with different fork springs and fork weight oil, but a lot of them end up replacing the damper rod damping with emulators, which simulate a cartridge style fork. Now, while you're not going to be able to keep up with a YZF-250, you are going to get much better performance and much less bottoming out, and it makes the DR a much more competitive dual sport motorcycle. On the rear of the Dr650, you're going to find Suzuki's full floater link style suspension. And it's not a bad suspension overall. Like the front, it's a little bit undersprung, but it's compliant, and for me it does the job. The only modifications that I have on this bike is a slightly heavier spring because of my slightly 250-pound frame and the fact that I do carry a little bit of luggage. Now, a lot of DR owners will tell you if you truly want to use this bike aggressively off-road, you're going to have to do a couple things. One would be to revalve the shock assembly that's inside the DR, or probably the better option is to replace the shock and spring assembly altogether with something more modern and aftermarket. The problem with that is you can spend over $1,000 on a high quality shock on a bike that you paid $3,200 for. The DR really is a simple bike, and the people that buy this bike usually understand that it does have some limitations, myself included. Now, there are some DRs out there with amazing suspension modifications that can fully keep up with a KTM or a Husqvarna out in the dirt. But realistically, if you want that type of performance, why not just buy that type of bike? Tires are another area that a potential DR purchaser should really look at. If you're buying a fairly new DR, chances are it's coming with the Bridgestone trail wings that came stock from the factory. Now, these tires don't have a really great reputation amongst dual sport riders. In fact, they call them death wings in most areas. And the fact that the DR comes with a 17-inch stock rim on the rear can limit tire choices. Now, it's not bad. There's still a lot of great tires to choose from. It's just some of the more modern tires available may not be available in that 17-inch tire size. So it's something you want to consider when you're thinking about a DR650 as your dual sport ride. The heart of any motorcycle is its engine. And in the case of the DR650, you're talking about a single cylinder, 644cc, single overhead cam, 4-valve head, 5-speed transmission, and a carburetor. Now, criticized by some for lack of horsepower, the DR really only produces around 4,500 depending on the tune. And that 5-speed transmission also draws some criticism for not having the best highway manners. But I beg to differ. I personally think that the engine and transmission combo works really well in this simple of a bike. The lack of liquid cooling makes the bike easier to work on for the average person. There's less systems to worry about. And quite honestly, cruising around at 65 to 70 miles an hour or around 120 kilometers an hour, the bike just purrs right along. I think most people would be more concerned with how high the bike sits and how side winds can impact your enjoyment on the highway. I do tend to use this bike more on back roads than I do on highways. And let's face it, there's more things to see back there anyway. The fact that the bike is air-cooled, it's carbureted, and doesn't really have any computers to speak of means the DR650 can be a great choice for those that want to travel across the country or, like me, just want to tinker a little bit and understand motorcycle systems in general. And the aftermarket support for this bike is really solid. As I said earlier, it's been in manufacture for over 25 years, meaning that aftermarket third-party manufacturers have had ample time to resolve most of the DR650's shortcomings. And let's not forget the price. You can purchase a brand new DR650 for under $6,700 Canadian. Now that's $900 less than the comparable DRZ400 sold by Suzuki side by side. And those $900 can be applied to those manufacturers to solve those shortcomings that the DR has. So the difference between those two bikes really comes down to a hard choice for most owners. So if the DR650 is really such a prehistoric creature, it begs the question, how can Suzuki continue to sell this model in 2021? And I have a couple opinions on that. One, it comes down to the rider. And my personal feeling is there's two types of riders. There are riders that buy brand new motorcycles and have those motorcycles serviced at the dealership, and there's nothing wrong with that. But then there is the second type of rider. The rider who at 10 o'clock at night in Cochrane, Ontario, decides to pull the carburetor off of their motorcycle and clean it in the hotel room because they felt the idle wasn't quite right that morning. It's those types of riders that the DR650 speaks to. It's those types of riders that find the simplicity of this motorcycle appealing. Riders like myself. There's no cooling system to deal with. It's a simple air-cooled 4-stroke engine, and there's no computers or systems that may go wrong electrically out in the middle of nowhere. That appeals to myself. The other thing that keeps the DR selling year after year is loyalty. I know a couple DR owners that have bought 2 or 3 of these bikes in a row. They just keep buying them. They trade one in and they buy a brand new one. And it's that type of loyalty that basically keeps these bikes in production. Now, if you spend any amount of time on forums, you're going to find that most DR owners really like the idea that the bike is a bit of an underdog. they can take the bike and tune it the way they like it, add some suspension modifications, and make a bike competitive with machines that cost 2 or even 3 times as much. And I like that myself. It's fun to tinker on, and it's fun to take a bike that maybe people underestimate and make it competitive. I don't think there's anybody out there that exemplifies that more than the Australians. If you peruse around YouTube or again get on some forums, you're quickly going to come to realize that the Australian bush pig is almost a national treasure. YouTube channels like Biker Bits or Cross Training Adventure can take these bikes and show you what they're actually capable of, and they display it in a setting that's absolutely stunning. I mean, Australia is beautiful. And it's that type of loyalty and that type of commitment that keeps the bike being purchased year after year. With this much fan loyalty, it probably means Suzuki's going to sell the Dr650 forever, right? Well, wrong. Tightening global emission standards are threatening the Dr650's existence, and more than likely, Suzuki's going to have to look at either completely redesigning the bike or basically putting it out to pasture. Rumor is that the DRZ400 will probably be able to sneak through emission laws because it's more alike to an enduro than it is to a dual sport. And if that's the case, we may not see the big Dr650 anymore. But there is some hope. The recent release of the new KLR650 is sort of the direction that Suzuki may choose to go. The bike really wasn't changed all that much. It was simply updated with fuel injection and ABS to meet those safety and emission standards worldwide. And if Suzuki chooses to do so, we may even see a liquid-cooled version of the Dr650. Only time will tell, but it will be interesting to see what happens with the big old girl. So what's my opinion on the Dr650? What are my thoughts on it? Well, it's not a perfect dual sport motorcycle, but by definition, dual sport motorcycles are compromise bikes anyway. And I don't really think there's a perfect dual sport bike out there. The DR does strike a good balance between off-road capability and on-road manners though. And for me, a person who doesn't take it to a motocross track, but basically rides gravel roads or logging roads up north, it does quite fine off-road. Its on-road mannerisms are really quite good, and aside from the poor saddle on it, the ergonomics are pretty decent. I did lower my foot pegs with an optional bracket that I bought, but other than that, the riding position's pretty good. And you can't beat the price on the bike. Like I said, I paid $3,200 for mine, and it came with a safari tank and a windshield, and it was in really good condition. So even brand new, a DR rider has a little bit of extra money in their pocket to solve some of those issues that plague the bike. If you're going to use it for an adventure bike, you're going to want to upgrade the tank. But 13 liters really only gets you about 250 kilometers. And believe me, you're going to want to get off the bike anyway at that time, but it's really about if you're taking it in places where fuel is a questionable commodity, you want to have fuel reserves. You can always get off the bike at any time to stretch, but you want to be able to get from point to point. With 30 liters on board, I can get close to 700 kilometers between fuel stops, so it gives you some confidence in the bike's ability to get you where you want to go. The simplicity of the bike, for me, is a plus. For others, the lack of conveniences may be a bit of a question. But again, I like to tinker on the bike, and I bought it for that reason. So would I advise people to buy this bike if they're looking for a dual sport? Well, yes, provided they know what they're buying. If they're going to buy this bike expecting it to keep up in more aggressive off-road conditions, they probably should be looking at a Honda XR650 as their first dual sport bike. And if they're looking to buy a stock Dr650 and use it as more of an adventure touring bike, then the KLR 650 is probably a better choice for them, at least as an entry-level motorcycle. However, if they want to buy a bike that can do both things reasonably well and want to invest a bit of time and money into upgrading the bike, I think the DR650 is a great choice, and I would recommend it to anybody who has that type of thought process. I really like the fact that the bike is reasonably inexpensive and the aftermarket support for it is very, very strong. There's some really good websites out there and suppliers that provide just about anything you want for this bike. And for me, that's part of the hobby. On rainy days, I can come in here and add a few optional items. And then when I go out and ride it, I look at those optional items and think, man, oh man, that was a fun day in the shop. So yes, I would recommend this bike.
So what do you think? You think the DR650 might be a bike for you?
I think it might be the bike I'm looking for.
Really, eh?
Oh, yeah.
Well, then you've got to start hunting for one. There's a lot out there, Carl, and I think you're going to be able to find a decent machine.
Well, when I find one, I'll bring it over. You can tell me all about it.
All right, Carl. Until next time, have a nice day, and we'll see you again on Dino's Tinker Shed. All right, perfect.